Welcome, and thank you for joining us at this symposium, Telling the Truth 2020. We're very excited and grateful for our guest for this program. David Hopkins is a professor of political science at Boston College. He's also the author of this book, Red Fighting Blue, and the subtitle is How Geography and Electoral Rules Polarize American Politics. Welcome, David.
Thanks so much, Paul. It's really great to be with you.
So this election is still obviously being challenged by the incumbent president. There's a lot of drama behind the scenes about the counting of mail-in ballots. But your book was published in 2017. It seems like you were very prescient. It seems like we've sort of had these issues for a while, the division, the tribalism, the red state, blue state divide. So how are you responding to and reacting to this current election?
Yeah, the current election, obviously the winner is likely to be different, but a lot of the other elements of this election are very similar to the 2016 election. They're very similar to previous elections we've had. Very close national vote. Both parties are pretty evenly matched in terms of their base of support in the electorate. And most states and regions are pretty firmly aligned with either the Democrats or Republicans, and pretty much the blue states last time are still the blue states, and the red states last time are still the red states, and a few of the purple states have flipped, and there are a few states where there is some change. Obviously, there's a lot of attention given to states like Georgia, where the Democrats do seem to be gaining. But in terms of the big picture, we see a pretty stable regional alignment that has carried through really for the past 20 years, and not just in presidential elections. 4 years ago, every single Senate race went to the same party that won the state in the presidential election. In 2020, it looks like every single one, except for one in Maine, will have that pattern as well. So when we're talking about red states and blue states, increasingly, we're not just talking about presidential voting, we're talking about congressional voting, we're talking about even state level, state legislatures, governors. There's a lot of consistency and stability to our elections, even though there's also a lot of sort of superficial change and change in the which party happens to come out on top in any particular year.
Right. So we'll tackle the gorilla in the room, the outlier in all this, Trump, who seems to break all the rules and break all the molds. But in political science 101, we learn checks and balances is a good thing. The executive, the legislative, the judicial. It's nice that they kind of offset each other. Is this a good thing that it's so evenly divided between red and blue? And it seems like at least the rhetoric in terms of the division and the name calling and the hatred has ratcheted up several degrees. Do you see that too? Or do you think this is similar to what played out in several election cycles in the past?
Well, there are good and bad things, I think, about the polarization that we see. We certainly have lots of competition at the national level. We have two parties that really are fighting for our votes. We don't have, in the past, there was talk about the Republicans having a lock on the White House, Democrats having a lock on the House of Representatives. Those days are certainly gone.
Right.
So if you like competition, if you like the uncertainty about which party is going to come out on top in any given election, it's a really good era for that. But there's, of course, a downside as well, which is the ferocity of the competition sometimes means that, that there's a lot more, electioneering and election conflict, and a lot less coming together and trying to solve problems that face the country. Everybody's looking towards the next election. The party that's out of power thinks they're almost back in power potentially. The party that's in power is worried they're going to lose power. And so the dynamic becomes very conflictual. And there are obviously problems with that as well as positive aspects of it.
Right. So how do you think Trump aligns with the Republican Party? Certainly, he's not a traditional GOP candidate. In fact, it seems like he's really the party of Trump in a lot of ways. It seems like the support among, mainline traditional Republicans is fairly thin, and I wonder if it'll hold once he's out of the White House. Or do you think he really does tap into some traditional, red state principles?
Yeah, I think he's been surprisingly consistent with in terms of the most of where the support he gets comes from traditional lifelong Republicans. I mean, they're at the margins, and those margins are, as I say, potentially decisive. We've seen change in the coalition. We've seen Trump alienate certain types of people who used to be Republicans, especially well-educated people who live in large metropolitan areas in the northeast of the country or on the west coast of the country, people who are in professional occupations. Some of those people have obviously been alienated by Trump becoming the face of the Republican Party. On the other hand, Trump has brought in some support in small town and rural America in the middle of the country. He's increased Republican margins in a lot of states in the Midwest, in parts of the South and the interior West. And at the state level, the red state and blue state alignments haven't really changed all that much under Trump. There's been some evolution, but most of the map looks pretty much the way it did when Bush and Obama were president.
Did it surprise you of the a large number of Latino voters that Trump flipped this time in those kind of border communities when he came in on a platform demonizing people from Mexico as rapists, killers, etc., and wanting to build the big wall? Did that surprise you? I mean, he really turned the tables on the Democrats and that certain demographic anyway.
I was surprised certainly by the magnitude of the change. And you have these voters who really are historically pretty loyal Democrats. And Trump was able to pull off a very meaningful shift among Latinos. And we saw that not just in Texas and in Florida, but even up here in Massachusetts. The towns that shifted towards Trump this time were disproportionately places with large Latino populations.
Right.
I think that sometimes people overestimate the extent to which Latinos care about immigration and illegal immigration, and even race and civil rights as issues. Latinos, some of them do care a lot about those issues, but they're not single issue voters. And there's a certain appeal to the Trump message among Latinos that I think sometimes doesn't get adequately recognized in the media. And so the big question in my mind will be, is this the start of a more permanent shift? Is this a new normal for the alignment of the Latino vote? Or is this somehow a temporary shift that will swing back in 2 years, 4 years, or in the future?
Right. So we talked about your professor of political science at Boston College, and you teach primarily undergraduates or graduates as well?
Both.
Okay. What are you talking about in the classroom? I assume you've had a class since here we are 5 days or so after the election, and it's still turbulent and unfinished in some respects. What are the students interested in? And did the the record turnout, including a large uptick with young people, did that surprise you, or did you see that coming, talking to your students before the election?
I'm not shocked about the high turnout, though it is amazing. If you look at it, how high the turnout was, and it's the highest in more than 100 years, which really is amazing, especially since when I was in graduate school, people were talking about, the vanishing voter and
Right.
disengagement in civic life. And it's amazing to see how that's changed. I'm not, however, shocked by that, given the last 4 years. I mean, I think we've had 4 years in a country where regardless of what your side you're on, everybody's just talking and thinking about politics more. People care a lot about who's going to win. Trump obviously is very personally polarizing on both sides and sort of motivates both parties to come out. So Certainly with my students over the last 4 years, we've seen an increase in the number of political science majors on campus, an increase in the popularity of political science courses. And I think that very much reflects, young people coming of age during an eventful time in our political history. In terms of who we're talking about in class, well, this semester I'm teaching a class on the US Congress. And of course, I have a bit of a bias. I think, we talk, understandably so, we talk about the president and the presidency all day, every day in American politics, but there's not enough attention, in my view, in the media or among citizens on what's going on in Congress. And so before the election, we were talking about what might change in the next session of Congress based on the outcome of the election. Of course, there was speculation about the filibuster being abolished or the size of the Supreme Court being changed, or these sort of major changes potentially to our order. And then, of course, based on the actual results, those don't seem like they're going to happen. And of course, we can expect, I think, a lot more gridlock and and conflict in the next session of Congress as well. So we've sort of been combing through that as well as the presidential race.
Let's talk about the role of gerrymandering, because it's a great political tradition with Democrats and Republicans. I've read some long articles and books and good research and reporting that the Republicans in the last 8 years played the game better than the Democrats before, and were extremely successful and strategic about drawing those congressional election districts. How important do you think that is in terms of red state, blue state, and control of the House and the Senate? And will now the Republicans just play the game as it's an arms race with the Supreme Court? Will they just add 2 more seats now to get a majority of people who align with their philosophy, or do you think gerrymandering is set for now, or will it now just change, or does it always evolve?
Well, it's really important in the sense that obviously it's hard to turn a red state into a blue state or vice versa just based on how you draw the districts. I mean, people sometimes overstate how much the geographic polarization we see in congressional elections is due to district drawing. I mean, yes, at the margins, you can make districts safer or less safe. You can give one party an advantage or the other. But really, a lot of what we see is that fundamentally, states here in Massachusetts, it's pretty hard to draw a Republican district, even if you tried.
Right.
There's only so much you can do. Having said that, the fact that at the national level, we have such evenly matched parties, and we're going into a midterm election in 2022 where we'll have brand new set of districts being drawn, more of which will be drawn by Republican legislators than Democratic legislators in the states, means that it could be that that's the margin of victory in the next midterm election is based on control of the map making, and that certainly there are states that have a partisan advantage that comes from the district drawing. Ohio is a good example of that. Indiana, Pennsylvania, formerly, before there was a court case that redrew the districts and the Democrats gained a bunch of seats. So I would expect that in the next 2 years, as the redistricting process plays out, there's going to be a lot of good stories about how those districts are drawn. And that could end up making the difference in whether the Democrats can hang on in the midterm election, which of course is usually a tough election for the president's party. Could be even tougher for the Democrats if they're facing a bunch of districts that are not drawn in their favor.
Right. What do you consider the biggest factors in terms of this polarization, but how stable, the divide is, the red state, blue state? Is it inheritance? Is it, do you kind of go with the party of your parents? Is it economic factor? One party appeals more to the economics of versus the other party, or what is it that's stamped this so strongly into the national political landscape?
Well, there's certainly in general, just partisanship is getting stronger. Voters are becoming more party loyal, more consistent. They vote for one party for president and Congress and down the ballot year in and year out, which didn't used to be as true, which is part of what makes the maps as stable as they've been. But another factor specifically, and this is part of the argument in red fighting blue, is that as the basis of partisan competition in American politics has changed from being, in the past, a party system that was primarily based on economics and economic interests and class differences, into a party system that's much more strongly also about culture and cultural differences. That has real implications for the stability of the geographic alignments, because as it turns out, public opinion on cultural issues is a lot more regionally divided than public opinion on economic issues. And so the more our party system becomes about culture, the more some parts of America are going to be pushed towards the Democrats, other parts of America are going to be pushed towards the Republicans. And that's really what's happened over time, over the past 25 or 30 years, has been the sort of culture war. And we always, of course, had cultural issues, being important in American politics, but sometimes they cross party lines. They weren't always as salient. What we have in today's era is a culture war that's also a partisan war, that's also a regional geographic war. And that's really sort of a lot of the story when you're looking at the map of which party wins where, and the stability of all these state and regional alignments. A lot of it has to do with the fact that this is the turf that the parties are battling on much more than was true in the past.
What are those defining characteristics, do you think? The quote unquote litmus test for a long time was abortion between the parties and the red and blue. Then it was tax policy. And then maybe it was, I don't know what you'd term, like education, the prevailing conventional wisdom over philosophy, liberal versus conservative and things. What is it now, do you think? What marks and attracts these two sides and is cohesive to them?
I think a lot of it started with abortion, religion in general, role of religion and sexuality in public life and public policy in the 1980s and 90s, where you first saw the beginning of the current regional alignment, the South moving much more towards the Republicans, not just in presidential voting, but congressional voting, the Northeast and the West Coast moving more towards the Democrats. But more recently, we're seeing other issues emerge and get pushed onto that same divide. Immigration is a good example of that. Certainly race and gender are becoming more salient areas that really divide the parties much more than they used to. And so there's a reinforcement of a whole bunch of these different sort of cultural considerations, and the specific issues sometimes are we've had some elections where gay marriage was a big issue, other elections of immigration has been more of an issue, but they all sort of follow this pattern of, are you open to a sort of changing country where things get more progressive and you're sort of happy with the cultural drift of this American society, or are you alienated from that and are you registering your opposition to that in the way that you vote? And so the sort of larger theme of change versus traditionalism in society and culture more broadly is really just such an elemental component of our party and electoral conflict in our current era. And that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. It seems just to be stronger and stronger as we move along.
I mean, these two parties have dominated, American politics since the beginning of the Republic. Do you see a way for a third party? There were a couple, I remember John Anderson, Ross Perot. In a way, I always found Trump really a third party, even though he did align with the Republicans. He was just as dismissive and critical of the Republicans in certain ways as the Democrats. But do you feel that there is a way for for a third party, or is there just too much money and too much infrastructure behind these two parties?
Yeah, I think that the barriers toward that keep the two-party system in place are really strong, and that hasn't really changed. Even all these other things have changed. That has really changed, and that hasn't changed. You know, it's really tough to found a third party, to get it going, to get it viable, to win enough seats, to convince enough voters to abandon the two parties, especially in an era when people see there being a big difference between the Democrats and Republicans. It's tougher to say, oh, it doesn't matter, you know, come on over into this third party instead. And in some ways, Trump has demonstrated how permeable the major parties can be. You don't have to sit outside of the major parties to run an insurgent race. You can take over one of the major parties, and that's actually a much easier path to power.
Right.
And similarly with what we're seeing in the Democratic Party, where you're seeing some people on the left who used to be pretty disdainful of two-party politics now starting to organize within the Democratic Party. That, you know, sort of the elements of the Bernie Sanders or AOC coalition basically saying the Democrats are our home and we're going to try to take over the Democrats and move them to the left rather than try the Green Party or the Socialist Party or you know, some sort of third party. That really, you know, the smart way to do this is to work within the two-party system and try to, you know, capture one of the major parties. And so
Right.
I think that's maybe the lesson that a lot of people are taking from our current era is the two parties as parties are very strong and not going anywhere, and it's difficult to dislodge. But once you get inside one of them, you know, you can actually get really far really fast.
But I think in the end, it seems like at least the Democrats always move towards a centrist candidate. I mean, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren had a lot of steam in the primary, but when it really came down to it, they were uncomfortable or didn't feel like it was you know, the right person to put up against Trump. That's why I never don't really understand Trump. I wouldn't call him a centrist at all. There were other candidates in that pack of Republicans in 2016 that were much more centrist. So I don't know, did he break that, you know, mold too as well? Or do you think the country still yearns for like a centrist, either Democrat or centrist Republican to become president?
Yeah, those are great points. I mean, for one thing, I'll say the parties are not symmetrical in this way. And as you point out, you know, the Democrats, I think, pretty intentionally resisted moving themselves too far to the left in this last election. And that's why Biden became the nominee. In part was the belief that it would be a mistake to move too far in the Sanders direction. But, you know, the left is a force within the party that I would say it wasn't as much of a force 10 or 20 years ago. That is where I think the change is. In terms of Trump, you know, Trump, when he ran in 2016, did run as something of a maverick ideologically. And we have some evidence that suggests voters did pick up on that. That in fact, they saw him as more moderate than other Republicans. And that was one of the advantages he had in the general election against Hillary Clinton, was that a lot of voters saw him, in particular on economic issues, as pretty much a centrist, not someone on the right, the extreme right. However, once Trump actually got in and became president, he turned out to be a very conservative president. And a lot of his ultimate priorities in office were much more on the right side of the Republican Party and the sort of the maverick centrist elements of Trump, the Trump who was going to prioritize infrastructure and was going to crack down on corporate outsourcing and things like that. That Trump never really appeared in the governing phase
Right.
as opposed to the campaign phase. And that was, I think, a surprise to a lot of people. And it might be that, you know, it's easy to say in retrospect, and it might be in retrospect, that was a mistake that
Right.
Trump, you know, that was a road not taken that might have been more fruitful for Trump, thinking about his ultimate defeat for re-election, is if he had proven to govern as a centrist to the extent that he ran as a centrist 4 years ago.
So assuming we do have an inauguration and a new Biden-Harris administration in the third week of January, and Trump isn't still, chaining himself to the White House or something, what are you going to be looking for in terms of, your research, red fighting blue? Who has the toughest job? I mean, Nancy Pelosi has trying to hold those warring factions together, but Mitch McConnell, with a razor thin margin as well, realizing that in the past he has been able to compromise and get things done with Biden, and when Biden was in the Senate, I think they have a mutual respectful relationship. Do you think the way this divisiveness stands right now, that they'll be able to come together on relief packages, on coronavirus plan, and are you hopeful with moving forward with all the issues that face the United States?
I think there's some room for cooperation, and something like COVID or economic relief is where there's the most room. I think there are elements that both sides can get behind, and it would be popular for incumbents of both parties to support and to get through. So that's an area where maybe we could see some compromise. I don't think there's going to be that much more compromise than that, though. If you sort of widen out to the other issues that that face the country, the parties are so polarized, so divided on so many of them. And even if in principle you could split the difference and find areas of common ground, there's such a political calculation to not wanting to give the other side a victory, trying to embarrass and frustrate your opponents because you want to capitalize it on that in the next election.
Right.
I'm not sure that dynamic will be any different, in the next 4 years than it was in the last 4 years, or the last really 10 or 20 years.
Yeah.
We've just sort of entered this era of polarization that has a kind of a reinforcing quality to it. It's sort of each side ratchets up and it gets more and more fervent, and there's not an incentive for either side to kind of back down. So Biden, I think personally, will maybe not be as polarizing a figure. I don't think he will set out to to be that kind of leader, but there's only so much he can say to Republicans to win them over. I mean, they have their own base to worry about. They have their own supporters and their own media to keep happy. And of course, Trump will not necessarily be going anywhere either. He'll be tweeting from the sidelines,
Exactly.
and stirring things up in his own way. So I'm not sure, again, that this is a recipe for fundamental change. I think it's a recipe for some things to change with a new president, a new party in charge of the White House. But there's an awful lot else about American politics, I think, that's probably going to keep right on going the same direction it already is.
Thank you, David Hopkins, professor of political science at Boston College. The book is Red Fighting Blue. And I think, as you've mentioned, that these patterns are set. We're going to be dealing with this for some time to come, this division and tribalism. We appreciate you being part of Telling the Truth 2020, and let's see what happens after the January inauguration. But thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Paula. It was really, really fun to talk with you.
Thanks a lot.